Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, a website in English about Ukraine. Today we will talk about solidarity, the cases of solidarity during the war. We have visited a few villages recently, in particular Motyzhyn and Makariv around Kyiv, and we will tell you a few stories about this. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. I'm talking to Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the oldest and biggest Ukrainian media NGOs. You can always support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We spend a big amount of your support, of your donations on helping the people affected by this war and on these trips, for example, this one that we will be talking about today. So let's talk about these stories. The first story we would like to share is a story how Makariv, a village which heavily suffered from the war, heavily damaged during the war, itself is now accepting the refugees, the displaced people from the newly occupied territories, for example, from the eastern Ukraine. In Makariv, we have talked to a woman from Volnovakha who is called Oksana, and she told us her story. Let's talk about this.
Yes, indeed. So it was our second trip to Makariv, and I remember when we arrived in this culture center with humanitarian aid. As far as we brought some humanitarian aid, there was a kind of a list of people who were in need of this help. And the director of the center, she said that some people who are on the list, some of them are simply retired people from Makariv, I don't know, old elderly people, but some of them, a special group, is displaced people. So people who were coming from the eastern villages, eastern towns, people from Mariupol, for example, people from Volnovakha, from other places. So people whose houses and whose villages and even towns are completely destroyed are coming to a kind of also partially destroyed place, and they continue to live. And this is about the solidarity, because people in Makariv, they are also traumatized by the war, by these battles during March, but now they're accepting people from the east. And this woman, we were lucky to talk to. She told us her story about her departure from Volnovakha. Let's situate Volnovakha. Volnovakha is a town close to Mariupol in Donetsk region. She was a school teacher for many years. She has two kids. One of them is a student of a university in Kharkiv, Skovoroda University in Kharkiv, the same the university which was destroyed several weeks ago. It was touched by a Russian missile. And she told us the story of the first week in Volnovakha when the extremely intense shelling started. She was unable to walk because schools were closed. Then her husband, he was working on the railway, but he had no work at that very moment. They spent the first week in Volnovakha, but then they decided to flee, to leave the Volnovakha, because Russian troops were arriving quite quickly to Volnovakha. We know that Volnovakha was occupied even before Mariupol, quite quickly. So they left to Dnipro region. They stayed for a couple of months there in a village, and she also told the story of solidarity of local people who accepted people to live for free in a kind of how they call it, a kind of
a shelter?
Shelter for displaced.
A dormitory.
Dormitory maybe for workers, for a kind of industry. And then as far as this woman, she has a chronic illness, and she has to be close to Kyiv because she needs regular visits to a central hospital. We don't know exactly which kind of illness she has, but she needs some monitoring from this hospital. She was in search of a kind of a place close to Kyiv, but at the same time not so expensive. And her friends suggested her Makariv, and she was able to rent for a modest price an apartment in a building here in Makariv. In fact, some 100 meters from these multi-storied buildings in Makariv, which were destroyed during Russian occupation. Her second son, he's 7 years old, if I'm not mistaken, so she will be attending a school later, maybe starting from September. And the story is that she was very happy to find this place in Makariv. They are in security in that place now. She is able to continue to work because she's a school teacher, and they will be organizing things online. They were already organizing things online during March, April, and May, and they will restart that starting from September. And surely enough, we ask the question, how do you feel here in Makariv, and do you feel any kind of support from locals, from local people? And she told us a story about the humanitarian aid, that a retired woman, elderly woman, she got her humanitarian aid in the culture center. And on her way back, she dropped in the apartment of Oksana, and she gave her a pot of this humanitarian aid, saying that you are in need, so we have to share. And this is something which impressed this woman very much, because it was an elderly woman who was also in need, because we know that she retired people, they are not so rich in Ukraine. They receive just a very poor not salary, but poor sum of money monthly. And she was quite open to this family, and this was something impressive for this woman from Volnovakha. They all still hope they will come back home, but at that moment, this is about the two groups of people. One group of people which suffered a lot from Russian battles and occupation, another group of people coming directly from the front line.
So let us try to understand this story. The story about some people who are living near Kyiv in Makariv, which is heavily damaged town, and you can listen to our podcast about Makariv. There are indeed many private buildings which are completely destroyed. Especially on the street, which is called Shlyachetska Street, where you have private housing, and there is just an empty space on the place of a private house. And of course, these people were evacuating in March during these hostilities. And I think they were evacuating at the same time when these Oksana were fleeing from Volnovakha. It was the same time. Then at the late of March, people from Makariv came back to Makariv. This was liberated. Volnovakha is occupied by the Russians. So now we have stories of people who are coming from this eastern Ukraine to the places which also suffered, which were also damaged. So this is kind of a very specific solidarity, because this is a big difference to 2014. In 2014, people who were coming, the displaced people, were coming to places which were not touched by the war. And of course, they were also welcomed. Basically, the majority of stories are normal stories. There were, of course, bad stories about misunderstandings, about hostile attitude to the people from the eastern Ukraine. But now I think these cracks, which were in 2014, they do not exist, because people in Makariv understand what it means to be under shelling in the same way as people in Volnovakha, people from Kramatorsk, people from Severodonetsk, etc. So it seems that the country is covered by the wounds, and some places which are wounded accept other people which are also wounded too, but who cannot come back.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right, trying to underline this difference with 2014, because in 2014 there was a kind of an idea that in a way people from the east, from Donbass, were guilty for being attacked by Russia because they were pro-Russian, etc. It wasn't true. But now Ukrainians in all regions, in Central, in the North, in the South, in the West, they do understand that there is no reason for this aggression, and you don't provoke Russia. Russia attacks wherever you are. And there are a lot of much more of solidarity. This is exactly for that reason, because you don't call for Russia, but they come. And it happens in Makariv, and it happened in Donetsk and Lugansk in 2014. So there is no more this artificial idea about pro-Russian people in the East. Yes, indeed, in 2014 there were some people who were welcoming Russians, but there was a minority. But in the rest of the countries, there was a kind of idea that these people were guilty. That's why Russia is attacked, and that's why these regions were occupied. Today we see that this is simply not true, and there's a solidarity between victims in a way, because both groups, I mean, in Makariv, in Bucha, and in Volnovakha, Mariupol, people, civilians, they are victims of this aggression.
Yes, and we asked this Oksana if she intends, if she is thinking of coming back to Volnovakha, and frankly, I was expecting an answer. No, I actually will live with understanding that I will never come back to it. Maybe we could have expected this answer, but instead we got the answer of confidence that yes, I will come back. We are waiting for the liberation of Volnovakha, and her house is there. It seems that it is not damaged by the warfare, so she has a place to return. But of course it will depend. She cannot return as a Ukrainian teacher, a teacher of Ukrainian school, who speaks perfectly Ukrainian. Of course, she cannot come back right now. Some of the teachers stayed in Volnovakha, and it seems that it is also a cleavage, right? A cleavage of people who stayed and who are now working for Russian schools, for Russian occupation authorities, and those people who left.
Yes, she, in fact, she described in a way the relationship between people from Volnovakha who left and who stayed. She talked about the communication. First of all, communication is difficult because there is no more Ukrainian mobile networks there. But when she's lucky to reach some ancient colleagues from school or families of pupils, because, for example, she was asking people if their kids will be continuing to follow her online lessons starting from September. She said that communication is quite bizarre. Why? Because she asks, for example, people, how are you doing? What's happening in Volnovakha? How is what the life looks like? And in responses, she doesn't get any kind of description of political judgment. She says, people say, everything is okay, your house is still here, trees are in flowers, or something something very concrete, not describing the real situation. And she described it like some troubles in communication, because people are in occupied territories. They don't feel free to talk. They are afraid of persecutions, and they're not open. They can describe what they see, but they are afraid to say any kind of statement, any kind of judgment of what's
Not
going
only
on.
political statements, but even description of the situation, like what is happening, if there are battles, if there are explosions. They are not talking about this. They are silent. And this is another thing that surprises us, that people in the occupied territories are either censored, so either they are told not to talk, they are told by the occupation authorities, or this is a kind of a self-censorship. They are afraid that they will be punished by the occupation authorities if they talk. And this is very specific thing. I think that can explain what was happening during the Soviet times, why we have so much silence about it, why we have so much silence about Holodomor, or the repressions or the killing of people. That was a society when you're afraid to talk. That was a society of self-imposed silence, or the silence which is imposed from the outside. And I think we are living, if we're talking about newly occupied territories, we are living in a society which is quite close to it. And the whole difference with the Ukrainian society, in which people are open and people are talking very much, and people are trying to tell their stories, even if they're very tragic stories and very dramatic stories. Let's come back to the solidarity thing. What impressed me is that these people in the culture center, they have a kind of how to say it, a notepad in which they write down all the names, all the surnames, the phone numbers of people to whom they are giving this humanitarian aid. We also see lots of things that volunteers from all across Ukraine brought here. We ourselves brought some food, and there is a place where there is a storage for food, but also there is a place of the clothes, right? And people are coming and getting these clothes. So indeed, I think this story shows us this incredible thing, how different parts of Ukraine are now much closer to each other than they were before, of course, because of these tragic circumstances. Let us talk about another village, which is not far away from Makariv, which is called Motyzhyn, to which we also went this time. And in this village, there was a tragic story, because the head of this village, Olga Sukhenko, was killed, was murdered by the Russian soldiers, together with her husband and with her son. And then their grave was discovered in a forest. So she was killed not alone, but with her family. And this was, of course, a very big story in Ukraine. So we came to Motyzhyn and talked to a woman who knew Olha Sukhenko very closely, and she tried to tell her story.
Yes, indeed, this story is quite, it's really tragic. Let's explain that Motyzhyn is a small village compared to Makariv. It is about 1,000 inhabitants in this village. If Makariv is a kind of a center, so 13,000 people, culture center, kids, schools, etc. In Motyzhyn, you have only 1,000 of population. You have only once again, culture center is a center of the social life in this village. And Motyzhyn was also occupied. Well, it was not also, because Makariv wasn't occupied. For sure, some streets were occupied in Makariv. Motyzhyn was completely occupied by the end of February already. And this head of the village, Olga Sukhenko, was somebody extremely brilliant, according to what we've heard about her during this conversation. She was quite young for this position. She was 50 years old, and she was a leader of this village for many years already. And she was really somebody who took care of the village in many aspects of that life. For example, she organized this huge rebuilding of this culture center. She was taking care of the roads, of all the common activities in the village, and she stayed as many herds of the villages we observed in many other villages. For example, in Brovary region, the question frequently asked, why you stayed in the village if you had the opportunity to leave it, to evacuate. These people, they were staying to help people, to help their neighbors and the whole village during the occupation. So Olga Sukhenko and her family, they stayed together with their son, and she was quite busy during all this time. She was bringing food to people who were unable to find something. She was taking care of the village, and the tragedy of this situation is that she was killed 3 days, on the 23rd of March, she was killed 3 days before Ukrainian troops deoccupied the village. So she was here during the whole month of occupation. She survived. There was no problem. But she was killed just before Ukrainian troops came. And we talked to people in Motyzhyn, and nobody is sure, nobody knows for sure what was the exact reason of this murder. So, and why Russians, they killed her just before they left.
Yes, this is indeed a big question. We can suspect that Russians suspected her of helping the Ukrainian army, of helping the Ukrainian resistance. Knowing this person, basically Motyzhyn is indeed a nice village with paved roads, and we asked a woman who knew her how they were living, because she had power in her village for decades. Before she was a starosta, after this decentralization reform, self-governance reform, she was also in the village council, the head of the village council, and people were voting for her, re-electing her, and they were living quite modestly. So this was an example of a good, wealthy Ukrainian peasant who would own her shop, who would also have some business maybe. Her husband also had some business, some car repair business. But they were not people who would, steal money or who would accumulate wealth. They were living as other villagers, and they were really taking care of the village. So they were investing the public funds into the public causes. And maybe this was something that pushed her also to do some activities which Russians suspected. The question is that that woman we talked to, she actually also showed us one of the patterns of the occupation. During the whole month, she has never seen a Russian soldier, because she was sitting in her house and not going to the village, not going out to the streets. So this is also one of the patterns. So we talked about many patterns of the occupation. Some people talked to soldiers, some people were tortured by Russian soldiers, some people were killed, while some other people haven't just seen them, despite the fact that they were during 1 month of the occupation. Talking about Olha Sukhenko, it seems that they were kind of coming for her several times, and the question we are asking is that why did they kill her, despite the fact that they would not make any big massacre in Motyzhyn. It's not like Bucha that they will killing hundreds of people. It seems that Olga Sukhenko, maybe a few other people, a few other boys, I think, who just worked for kind of intelligence for Ukrainian army inside the village, were killed. So we're talking about several people, not the dozens of people, not hundreds of people. But this might show indeed that maybe this was a revenge for something. So Russians were preparing to go away, and they decided to kill the head of the village. And also the question why, okay, you're killing the head of the village, but why are you killing the members of the family, right? The husband and the son. The son is very young, I think like
He's
about
from
20
96,
years old.
Yeah, 96.
Yes, and the son actually could have escaped, because he came to the village after 24th of February. He was living, I think, in Kyiv, right. So it's also another story how people who try to escape from the war actually came to more dangerous places. But these are the stories we wanted to talk to you about, to tell you. Both are the stories of a solidarity. In one case, we're talking about solidarity from one wounded place towards people from another wounded place, another damaged place. And in the second case, we're talking about this kind of very specific feel when the head of the village feels so much solidarity with the dwellers of the village, with people around her, that she stays in the village and risks her life. We have seen many other stories in which the starostas of the village risked their lives but did not leave their community. This is also this type of stories that we notice so much in Ukraine. How incredible is the action of people on their level of responsibility, on the villages, on the level of towns, on the level of the utility companies, on the level of the emergency service, how these ordinary people show the extreme, sometimes heroism. And this is probably that impresses us the most in this situation, that suddenly you realize that your country is surviving not because of top politicians, top intellectuals, top businessmen, but on the fact that on each possible level there are such remarkable people who help others, who resist, who do not let them subjugate, and this is incredible.
Yeah, that's it, exactly. So, and these horizontal links in Ukrainian society are maybe the most important, and they explain Ukrainian resistance, in fact. So this capacity of Ukrainians to organize, to self-organize on the level of a village, and when a teacher of dance becomes a volunteer helping people to evacuate, where young boys who don't have driving license, they also driving cars to evacuate people, when people who are not professionals. And territorial defense is what we call army composed of civilians, so people who had no military experience. And these boys from territorial defense without driving license, they were evacuating people from Makariv. We already told this story. And everybody on its level, on his or her level, is trying to help in a way. So this is stories of solidarity which help Ukraine resist. And that's why these stories are important.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. We have talked with Tetyana Ogarkova, who is in charge of international outreach at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld. UkraineWorld is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the oldest and biggest Ukrainian media NGOs. Listen to our podcasts on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, SoundCloud, Spotify. Don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to share it with your colleagues, with your friends. You can also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. We spent majority of your support to help people affected by this war in our humanitarian volunteer trips across Ukraine. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.